No one knew why Margaret Sullivan walked into the frozen lake that February morning, but deep down, the whole town knew something was ending. My name is Evelyn Brooks, and tonight I'm bringing you a story I found in a box of letters from 1973. A story about a woman who disappeared into silence and the daughter who spent 30 years listening for her voice. Margaret Sullivan was a piano tuner in Cedar Falls, Montana, a town so small that everyone knew the sound of everyone else's footsteps on the wooden sidewalks. She had this gift, you see. She could hear things others couldn't. A note, half a semitone flat. A string about to break. The lie in someone's laughter. She lived in a blue house at the edge of town with her daughter Claire. Just the two of them. Margaret's husband had died in a mining accident when Claire was 3. After that, Margaret never spoke about him. Never kept his photos, never said his name, but she played the piano every night. Claire told me once, years later, when she was older than her mother ever got to be, that she would lie in bed and listen to those melodies floating up through the floorboards, sometimes beautiful, sometimes so sad it made her chest hurt. I always wondered, Claire said, if my mother was trying to say something she couldn't put into words. Now here's where the story really begins. It was February 14th, 1973, Valentine's Day. Claire was 16 years old, and she'd been saving money from her job at the drugstore to buy her mother a record player. Something nice, something that would make Margaret smile the way she used to, before the sadness moved into her eyes. That morning, Claire wrapped the box in red paper and left it on the kitchen table before school. She wrote a note, "For all the music you've given me. Love, Claire." When she came home that afternoon, the box was still there, unopened. Margaret was gone. The front door was wide open. Snow had blown into the hallway. Margaret's coat was still hanging on the hook. Her boots were still by the door, but she was gone. Claire ran through the house calling for her, checked every room, the basement, the attic, nothing. Then she saw the footprints, bare footprints in the snow, leading from the back door toward the lake. Now, I need you to understand something. That lake was a mile away through the woods. The temperature that day was 12 degrees below zero. No one, and I mean no one, walks barefoot through Montana snow in February. But Margaret did. Claire followed those footprints, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The prints were small and precise, like Margaret had been walking with purpose, not running, not stumbling, walking. When Claire reached the lake, she stopped. The footprints went straight to the edge of the ice and disappeared. There was a hole in the ice, perfectly round, like someone had cut it with a saw. The water inside was black and still. Claire screamed for help. The sound echoed across the frozen lake, bouncing off the mountains, coming back to her like a ghost. Within an hour, half the town was there. Sheriff Daniels, the volunteer fire department, men with ropes and hooks. They searched that lake for 3 days. They never found Margaret Sullivan's body. What they did find, and this is the part that still makes my skin crawl, was Margaret's piano, sitting on the ice in the middle of the lake, a quarter-mile from shore. No tracks leading to it, no explanation for how it got there. Just the piano, sitting there like it had always belonged to the ice. Now, you might be thinking this is where the mystery ends. A tragic accident. A woman who lost her mind to grief and cold. But wait, don't miss this detail, because what happened next changed everything. 3 days after Margaret disappeared, Claire received a letter. It was in their mailbox, addressed to her in her mother's handwriting. No stamp, no postmark, like someone had hand-delivered it in the night. Claire opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single sentence. "I'm sorry I couldn't teach you the last song." That was all. Claire kept that letter, carried it with her for years, and she spent the next 3 decades trying to understand what her mother meant. But here's what you need to know about Claire Sullivan. She wasn't the type to let mysteries stay buried. She was her mother's daughter, stubborn, curious, and gifted with the ability to hear things others missed, so she started digging. She went through every piece of paper in her mother's house, every receipt, every note, every margin scribble in every book, every birthday card, every grocery list, every single scrap of her mother's life, searching for something that would explain why a woman would walk barefoot into a frozen lake. The house felt different after Margaret disappeared. Claire told me it was like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The neighbors brought casseroles and sympathy, but they stopped coming after a few weeks. Death people understand. Disappearance is something else entirely. Claire stayed in that house alone, 16 years old, and suddenly responsible for everything. The bills, the mortgage, the silence that filled every room like water. She got a job at the lumber mill office, finished high school at night, and every evening she would come home to that blue house and search for answers. For months, she found nothing. Then, one night in June, she was cleaning out the piano bench, something she'd been avoiding because it felt too much like giving up, and she found it. Hidden inside the bench, beneath the sheet music, was a journal. Brown leather, water-stained. The pages were filled with Margaret's handwriting, but it wasn't English. It was music, page after page of musical notation. No words, just notes, thousands of them, written in Margaret's careful hand. Claire didn't know what to make of it at first. She thought maybe her mother had been composing something, some grand piece she'd never finished. But when Claire tried to play the notes, they didn't make sense. The intervals were wrong. The progressions were chaotic. It hurt to listen to. It wasn't music. It was something else entirely. Claire spent weeks trying to decode those pages. She checked out every book on musical theory from the library. She asked other piano tuners in neighboring towns if they recognized the notation. No one did. She was about to give up when she remembered something. Her mother's old music teacher, Mr. Peterson. He'd taught piano in Cedar Falls for 40 years, and Margaret had studied with him when she was young. Claire found him living in a nursing home in Billings. He was 83 years old, nearly blind, but his mind was sharp as ever. She brought the journal to him. Mr. Peterson looked at those pages for maybe 10 minutes. His hands trembled as he turned each one, and then he closed the journal and looked at Claire with something like fear in his eyes. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "It was my mother's." Mr. Peterson was quiet for a long time, so long that Claire thought maybe he'd forgotten the question. But then he spoke, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Your mother was trying to remember something she was supposed to forget." That's when Claire learned the truth. Mr. Peterson told her that during World War II, Margaret hadn't been just a piano tuner. She'd worked for the government, for a program so secret that even 30 years later, he could barely bring himself to talk about it. They called it the Sound Project. The government had discovered that certain combinations of musical notes could affect human memory. Specific frequencies, played in specific orders, could make people forget things, erase traumatic memories, remove fear, reshape the mind itself. Margaret had been one of the composers. She'd spent 3 years in a facility in Nevada, writing music designed to make soldiers forget the things they'd seen in war, to erase the nightmares, to let them come home and be normal again. But something had gone wrong. The music worked too well. Soldiers who listened to Margaret's compositions didn't just forget the war. They forgot everything. Their names, their families, themselves. They became blank slates, sitting in hospital beds, staring at nothing, while doctors frantically tried to reverse what had been done. The project was shut down in 1946. Everyone involved was told to destroy their work and never speak of it again. They were threatened with prison if they ever revealed what they'd done. But Margaret couldn't destroy it, because she'd used the music on herself. Mr. Peterson's hands shook as he told Claire this part. He said Margaret had come to him in 1947, just after she'd gotten married, just before Claire was born. She'd been different then, haunted. She'd told him she'd done something terrible during the war, something she couldn't live with, and she'd asked him if he thought music could make you forget. He'd told her no. He'd begged her not to do whatever she was planning, but she did it anyway. She'd tried to forget something so terrible that she'd rather erase her own mind than live with the memory of it. And it had worked, but not completely. Fragments remained, pieces of memory that would surface in dreams, in the music she played at night, in the way she'd stop mid-sentence and stare at nothing, like she was trying to remember something just out of reach. Claire sat with this information for days. She didn't know what to do with it. Part of her wanted to let it go, to let her mother rest in whatever peace she'd found at the bottom of that lake, but she couldn't, because she kept thinking about that last sentence in the letter. "I'm sorry I couldn't teach you the last song." What song? What did her mother want her to forget? Claire went back to the journal. She studied those pages until her eyes burned, and slowly, painfully, she started to piece together what her mother had been trying to do. But here's where it gets even stranger. Claire started having dreams. Every night, the same dream. She's standing at the edge of the frozen lake, and she can hear music coming from beneath the ice, piano music. Her mother's playing. And in the dream, she knows, she absolutely knows, that if she can just break through the ice, if she can just reach the piano, she'll understand everything. But she can never break through. She wakes up every morning with her hands cramped, like she's been clawing at something in her sleep. This went on for months. And then one night, Claire did something she'd been afraid to do since her mother disappeared. She sat down at Margaret's piano and tried to play one of the songs from the journal. The moment her fingers touched the keys, something changed. The room felt colder, the air felt thicker, and Claire could swear she heard her mother's voice, very faint, like it was coming from another room. "Don't," the voice said. "Please don't." Claire's hands froze on the keys. She sat there for what felt like hours, not moving, barely, breathing. And then she understood. The journal wasn't just a record of what Margaret had created during the war. It was active. It was still working. The music itself carried the erasure pattern. And just reading it, just seeing those notes, was beginning to affect Claire's mind. She was starting to forget things. Small things at first. What she'd eaten for breakfast, the name of her coworker, the color of her mother's eyes. But then bigger things. The sound of her mother's voice, the feel of her mother's hand in hers, the shape of her mother's face. Margaret hadn't written that journal to help herself remember. She'd written it to transfer the forgetting, to pass it on to Claire, so her daughter could be free of whatever terrible thing Margaret had been running from. Now, you might be wondering what that terrible thing was, what Margaret had done during the war that was so awful. She'd erased her own memory, and then tried to erase her daughter's too. Claire spent 2 more years trying to find out. She tracked down other people who'd worked on the sound project. Most were dead. The few who were still alive refused to talk, but she kept digging, kept searching through declassified documents and old military records. And finally, she found it. A file marked Subject 47, Sullivan, Margaret. Inside was a report dated October 1945. It described an experiment. Margaret had been asked to compose a piece of music that would make a prisoner of war forget everything he knew, every secret, every mission, every name. The prisoner was a Japanese soldier who'd been captured in the Philippines. He'd refused to give information, so they used Margaret's music on him. It worked too well. The soldier forgot everything. But he didn't just become blank. He became something else. He started speaking in languages he'd never learned. He started remembering things that had never happened to him. Other people's memories. Other people's lives. The music hadn't just erased his memory. It had opened him up to every memory in the room. Every soldier who'd been present during the experiment. Every doctor. Every scientist. Their memories had poured into him like water into an empty vessel. He'd become a repository for other people's nightmares. And then he'd died. Just stopped breathing. Right there in the chair, while Margaret's music was still playing. Margaret had watched the whole thing. She'd seen what her music could do. She'd seen a man die because of something she'd created, and she'd carried that guilt for the rest of her life, until she couldn't carry it anymore. Claire sat in the library reading that report, and she finally understood why her mother had walked into the lake, why she'd gone barefoot through the snow, why she'd left no note except that one sentence about the last song. Margaret had been trying to complete the forgetting. She'd used the music on herself over the years, trying to erase the memory of that soldier's death, but it kept coming back. Fragments, pieces, his face, his voice, the moment he stopped breathing. So she'd tried one last time. She'd played the final song, the one she'd never taught Claire, and she'd walked into the lake while her mind was still blank, before the memories could return. She'd chosen oblivion over guilt, but the most shocking part was yet to come. Because when Claire finished reading that report, she found something else in the file. A photograph. It was Margaret, standing in front of a piano in 1945. She was young, 23 years old, wearing a white blouse and a dark skirt, her hair pulled back, her face serious. But standing next to her, his hand on her shoulder, was the Japanese soldier. Before the experiment, before the music, and on the back of the photograph, in Margaret's handwriting, was a single word, Kenji. Claire stared at that photograph for a long time, and then she understood something that changed everything. Margaret hadn't just felt guilty about killing a stranger. She'd loved him. Somehow, during the war, in that facility in Nevada, Margaret and this prisoner, this man named Kenji, had formed a connection. Maybe she'd been assigned to talk to him. Maybe they'd met by accident. Maybe it had started as compassion and grown into something more. But Margaret had loved him. And then she'd killed him with her music. That was what she'd been trying to forget. Not just the guilt, not just the horror of what she'd done. The love. Because forgetting the guilt meant forgetting him entirely. And Margaret couldn't bear to forget him. Couldn't bear to live with the memory of him. Couldn't bear either choice. So she'd spent 30 years in limbo, trapped, between remembering and forgetting, until finally she'd chosen the lake. Claire told me she cried when she figured this out. Cried for her mother. Cried for Kenji. Cried for the impossible choice that had broken Margaret's mind. And then she made a decision. She went back to that blue house in Cedar Falls. She took the journal, all those pages of musical notation, and she sat down at her mother's piano. And she played the last song, the one Margaret had never taught her, the one that was supposed to make her forget. Claire played every note, exactly as written. She played for hours, until her fingers ached and the sun came up. And nothing happened. The memories didn't fade. The pain didn't leave. She remembered everything, her mother's disappearance, the frozen lake, the journal, Kenji, all of it. The music didn't work on her. Maybe because she wasn't trying to forget. Maybe because she'd made peace with the pain. Maybe because love is stronger than any music, any magic, any attempt to erase it. Or maybe, and this is what I believe, Margaret had written the song wrong on purpose. She'd written it so it wouldn't work. Because deep down, beneath all the guilt and pain and desperation, Margaret hadn't wanted Claire to forget her, hadn't wanted to disappear completely from her daughter.